So this video is going to be on testing the oxygen sensors. We're going to test the oxygen sensor with a scope, a scan tool, and a DVOM. So we'll start with the DVOM and go from there. So I've got my DVOM hooked up to the oxygen sensor, and what I've done is I back probed the signal wire on the oxygen sensor. And I've got my DVOM set up, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the vehicle up and I'm going to monitor the oxygen sensor and see what it does. Now, oxygen sensors are kind of like catalytic converters. You have to warm them up in order for them to work. So let's go ahead and start it up and we'll see what happens. Now, if you remember from our chapter, oxygen sensors typically, just a regular old zirconia sensor like this one, is going to operate between 800 and 200 millivolts. So it's going to bounce back and forth. And right now you can see it doing that. It's going between 200 and 800 millivolts. And it should be cycling rather quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and rev the engine up a little bit so you can see what's going on when the engine revs up. So it's bouncing back and forth. One of the things you may want to do is use your min-max setting on here to make sure that you're capturing it. So I'm measuring the oxygen sensor, so I'm going to hit the min-max. And you'll hear it beep a few times. And then I'm going to rev it up just to make sure that I've got a good sweep on the oxygen sensor signal. And then what I can do is I can actually shut the vehicle off now. And I can scroll back and forth on this. So if I hit this, my maximum was 9, my minimum was 0. So you can see that I was well within the range for the oxygen sensor. So that's one of the things we need to do in order to test an oxygen sensor is to force it rich and force it lean. And we're going to do that with this propane enrichment tool that I have here. So this is, you've seen this before, you've seen me use this before. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to feed propane into the intake, and we should see the voltage on the oxygen sensor. The voltage should go up. Remember, if you have an abundance of fuel, then the voltage goes up. If you're lean, then the voltage goes low, lean low. And so the way we would force it lean is we would create a vacuum leak. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start the engine up and we'll get the oxygen sensor working. So let's go ahead and start the engine. And you can see the oxygen sensor kind of working. We'll warm it up a little bit and watch it start to cycle. Okay, now it's cycling. So we're cycling pretty good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to induce a vacuum leak. You notice it pegged low. Plug up the vacuum leak and it comes back up and it starts cycling again. So it's working that direction. So now let's give it a, make sure it starts working again. And I'm going to induce a little bit of propane in there, hydrocarbon. Okay, see it pegged up high and it actually stalled the engine. I put too much in there, but it went clear up to 9. So that means that oxygen sensor is working just fine. I was able to force it low and force it high. Oxygen sensor. So that's how you test it with a DVOM. So now let's look at the scope. Okay, we're going to test the oxygen sensor with an oscilloscope. And you can do one of two ways. You can either go into the automotive section here and use this drop-down menu, go to sensors, and this is going to be a lambda sensor, is what they call it on the picoscope. They don't call it an oxygen sensor. So you go over here to lambda, and then you've got to know whether or not you're dealing with a titania, a zirconia with a heater, or a zirconia pre and post cat, so you can compare the two. So that's one way you can do it. I'm not going to use the automotive setting. I'm going to go over here to the channel A, and I'm going to click on channel A. I'm going to make sure that I'm on the X1 meter lead, and then I'm going to go ahead and start the vehicle up and see what kind of pattern that I get. So all the other channels are turned off right now, just the channel A is on. So I'm going to start the vehicle up. And I had to change the millivolts per division. I changed it to 2 milliseconds, or 2 seconds per division. So just by using this drop down right up here, and then it was set automatically, it defaulted to 5 milliseconds, but it wasn't really giving me a very good picture. So now what I can do is I can rev the engine up a little bit and watch the oxygen sensor. So that oxygen sensor should be cycling at a regular pace up and down. So that right there, you see where it started doing the, this is actually a good signal right here. So now what I need to do is I need to force it rich and force it lean. So by forcing it lean, I'm going to create a vacuum leak. And then I'm going to plug the vacuum leak. Now if you see on this, let me pause it real quick. So this is where I plugged the vacuum leak right here, and it went rich. And in the previous screen, you could see where it dropped lean at an idle. So I'm going to go ahead and start the trace again. So here's my trace. At an idle, it's not cycling very much and very regular, so that tells me that the oxygen sensor is probably on its way out. I just created a vacuum leak. Right there, you can see it. And then I'm going to plug the vacuum leak off. And it goes high, so that's rich. And then it should start cycling again. There we go, it starts cycling again. So when it starts cycling again, if you remember back from our chapter on fuel trims, this is when the fuel trim kicks in, short-term fuel trim. So I'm going to do this again. So it's cycling, create a vacuum leak, and then it'll start cycling again if I leave the vacuum leak going long enough. There it goes, it starts cycling. Now I'm going to plug the vacuum leak, and now it's high. So I just plugged the vacuum leak, and then it's going to start cycling again here. Right about there, yeah. So this oxygen sensor is working okay. It's not cycling as much as I would like to see it at an idle, which means that it's probably starting to become lazy. So I can see whether it looks like when you're off idle. And that looks pretty good. But you have to remember that an oxygen sensor is very much like a catalytic converter. It has to be hot to work, and sometimes they cool off a little bit when you're idling. So that's as easy as it gets. So now let's take a look at the pre and the post cat oxygen sensor. So I'm just going to turn on channel B here. I'm going to click it on auto and see if it automatically grabs it. Ooh. No, I don't like that picture. So let's go to 2 volts. That's a little better. Let's try a little bit lower than that. Go 5 volts. There we go, that's better. So now I'm going to bring the trace. What I'm doing is I'm coming over here with my cursor on the far right hand side of the screen, and I'm going to bring that red trace down so that it's away from the blue trace a little bit. And I'm going to try going to 10 volts and see if I get a better signal. Now I'm going to rev the engine up and we can watch it again. You see how the bottom, the red trace, is not cycling as much as the top trace is, which tells me that the catalytic converter is doing something. It's actually working. So, and then like I say, to force it rich and lean, I'm going to rev it up and I'll force it rich and lean again so you can see how that works one more time. We'll wait till it comes back on screen here. Okay, we're cycling. I just created a vacuum leak. Now it's going to start cycling again. That's your fuel trims kicking in. I plugged the vacuum leak. There we go. So you can plainly see on this one, you can plainly see the forced rich and forced lean. Right here's where I forced it lean. Right here's where I forced it rich. And this is where I just left it lean. So anyway, you can see where the oxygen sensors are responding. The back oxygen sensor, the post-cat oxygen sensor, is not cycling as much as the front one, which is what it's supposed to do. If the catalytic converter was not working, then the back oxygen sensor would look the same as the front oxygen sensor, and that's when you typically get a catalyst efficiency code. So anyway, that's how you test an oxygen sensor with an oscilloscope. So now let's look at it with a scan tool. Okay, this is with the Snap-on Virus, and I've entered into the diagnostic mode, so I'm going to go to Engine Data, Data Display, and what I want to look at is engine data, and what I'm going to be looking for is oxygen sensors, and so here's oxygen sensor 2 and oxygen sensor 1. So I've got both of them on the screen here, and they're both right by each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the engine up, and we'll watch the numbers on there and see what they should be cycling back and forth. So if you see, it's going from 200 millivolts. This one, the oxygen sensor 2 is the post-cat, and it's right around 800 millivolts, 700 millivolts right there. So I'll point with my screwdriver so my big fat finger isn't in the way. So this one here is cycling between 100 and 800 millivolts, just like it's supposed to, and this one here is not doing a whole lot of cycling, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. So let's drop down the menu here and look at the wave trace on these. So now our numbers are up here that we're looking at, and we can see the trace. So this is a really easy way to do it. So here again, we're going to force it rich and we're going to force it lean and see what it does. So we force it lean, and we'll watch to see what happens. You see on this screen right here, it's going down really low, and we've got low numbers up here. And the fuel trim's just kicked in, and it's starting to cycle again. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix the vacuum leak. That forces it rich. And you see we've got a spike high. And it should happen almost instantaneously. So I'll tell you exactly when I open up the vacuum leak. So I'm going to open up the vacuum leak on 1, 2, 3. I just opened it up. And if you see, it happened almost instantaneously. I'm going to plug the vacuum leak. 1, 2, 3. I just plugged the vacuum leak. And there it is. So you can see it's almost instantaneously, and if you notice on the back one, it does affect the back O2 sensor as well when you force them rich, force them lean. So that's how you would test an oxygen sensor using a scan tool.